Yes. Hi, Redhead Whiskey here, and today I have a special guest, Colin from Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Aline.
So, Colin, I think the question that is always on my mind is what in the world does someone think about when they're opening a distillery? It's a crazy business. Why would you do that?
Right. For
What got you into
me,
it? Yeah.
yeah, for me, I grew up in Kentucky and not around the whiskey industry or the bourbon industry. But as soon as I moved to New York City, everyone, that was their point of reference for Kentucky. It was, they just sort of assumed that I knew something about whiskey or that I must have some sort of distillery connection, which
Mhm.
I didn't. Most people don't. Um, but I was really interested in the enthusiasm with which people were curious about whiskey at the time. And this is about 15, 20 years ago, when the American whiskey bourbon boom was just ramping up. So I kind of, through that enthusiasm of other people kind of curious about bourbon, curious about American whiskey, returned to Kentucky and traveled back with some moonshine that I had found. And kind of through that kind of, let's call it cultural exchange, became interested in, well, how would I become a distiller myself? How would I start distilling this moonshine that there's some curiosity around? And so got a still from the internet and started distilling in my apartment. Not with the thought of starting a craft distillery, because that really didn't exist back then, but really more with the thought of kind of learning the process and becoming a home brewer of spirits. Um, that has historically been illegal and what was then very much illegal. And so the government, its way of letting you be a distiller is to get a license. And so soon after that moment realized there was some opportunity to kind of continue this hobby moonshine making, but to do so in a commercially demised distillery, very small commercially demised distillery. And that's when we got our license in 2010.
Okay, so how was that shift from just creating, crafting in your living room or
Right.
kitchen,
Right.
boiling the corn,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
to
Uh-huh.
moving into something that is a little more structured?
Well, it's been going on throughout. When the business started in 2010, we just took the equipment from my kitchen, moved it into the sort of commercially rented space that was 350 square feet. There wasn't much process difference at that time. But then over the last 15 years, we've kind of scaled up and added new stills, bigger stills. The old stills support the new stills. The new stills then become the old stills and support newer stills. So we've kind of gradually scaled the production to now a point where we're doing about 4 barrels a day, from a time when we were making only about 1.5 gallons per 8-hour shift. And so through that
4 barrels
process,
a day, meaning bottling 4 barrels a day, or just four barrels
putting into the warehouse four
into the
barrels.
warehouse, adding
Yeah,
4 barrels every day.
right, right,
Okay,
right.
that's a lot. Okay.
Yeah. Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, it compares to something like Maker's Mark, where they do 200 barrels a day,
Well,
and they're
maybe.
considered sort of, on the smaller side of the Kentucky
Yeah.
industry. So, but we're a serious distiller. I mean, I think there's different sizes of being a distillery, and we're sort of squarely in this kind of medium category where we're not, we're not an internationally servicing Kentucky distillery, but we're also not like a garage band, sort of serving our neighborhood and not much beyond. We really do have an ambition to be a nationally recognized and relevant distillery out of the Northeast, which is a relatively new thing that people would accept the idea of a bourbon and even rye distillery out of the
That is not in
Northeast.
Kentucky.
Yeah, yeah, and the rye one is, I laugh at the rye because rye really belongs to the Northeast of New York,
Right.
Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
Maryland,
Yeah.
and only in the last 10 years have rye whiskeys been made there. There was a period of maybe about 10 or 15 years where no rye was being produced at all in the Northeast. So it's been kind of fun to rediscover rye whiskey as an opportunity for a Northeastern distillery.
Yeah, I'm very curious about Empire Rye and to talk a little bit about that. But before that, I have a really, where did you get the still on the internet? Can I get a
Well,
still on the
it's, yes,
internet?
a couple places actually. The first was from a company called Brew House, which really serviced like home brewers
Hmm.
and home distillers. Then scaled up to a company out of Kentucky called Hillbilly Stills, and they had larger vessels that could be heated with kind of the equivalent of a hot water heater tank.
Is that
Um,
copper ones or?
the still head was copper, the kettle was steel.
Mhm.
Um, and then in around 2014, we got the Forsyth stills that we're using now. And those are the beautiful sort of copper pot stills that you kind of imagine in your mind when you think of a Scotch whiskey distillery. But it's also a very important process distinction for Kings County because we're one of the few American whiskeys that is fully pot distilled in the way that you would think of a single malt Scotch being pot distilled or a
Right.
pot still Irish whiskey being pot distilled.
And I love
Um,
how the way you're connecting the traditional and the innovative and the American and the Scottish.
mhm,
I
mhm.
mean, I've been searching for peated bourbon since I started
Uh-huh.
drinking bourbon, and the closest I got to, I think, was Campfire, which
Sure.
has
Right.
nice barbecue flavor to it, but it's not peated for
Hmm.
sure. So I was
Hmm.
extremely happy to find. So how did you think about creating peated bourbon?
Right. Well, I could just say it wasn't initially my idea. We had a distiller, Rob Easter, who has his own whiskey company now, but he was busy working on. We were distilling bourbon, but we were also had a lot of barley around for single malt, and we were doing single malt with some peated and some unpeated barley. And so we had the peated barley in the distillery to be able to do that sort of very what I was aiming for, which was a more traditional Scotch single malt style of an American single malt being this new emerging category that's really looking to replicate to some degree what's happening in Scotland. And so I thought we could do something that was more on the traditional side of that. And so we had peated malt in the distillery for that. And we ran out of the regular malt that we were using for our bourbon. So Rob was like, "Can I just do peated bourbon?" And I said, "Well, do a couple barrels of it, and we'll see if we like it." And then a year went by, and we started to taste it, and it was pretty obvious that that was a really good, successful experiment. And so since then, we've leaned pretty heavily into it, and so we have about 20% of what we sell is our peated bourbon.
It's nice for a line of products to come up as an experiment.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, our opportunity with being a smaller distillery is that we can experiment and be creative. We're never going to be competitive on age or price. So what we have to do is differentiate and offer something that nobody else is and offer things that whiskey drinkers may crave, but the big companies, for whatever reason, don't want they don't want to
Risk.
to change what they're doing or do something that's so far away from tradition that they'll be perceived negatively. Whereas in New York, we have no distilling tradition really to to acknowledge. There is one; it's long ago, but we really get to define what it means to be a New York City distiller, a Northeast distiller, and for me, that is really about connecting to this old world, old tradition, and really playing with that in a way that improves what I would say the American whiskey tradition, which has gotten somewhat commercialized and commoditized and
Mm.
somewhat boring. And I can say that as a Kentuckian, bourbon, it it would be cool if it were very exciting and a lot of innovative, creative small distillers really embodying to some extent what you do more often see in Scotland, where there are smaller distilleries that play a very important role in that sort of landscape because of blended Scotch whiskey. And we just don't have in the United States, or didn't have in the United States until about 10 years ago.
So you come from Kentucky, and your inspiration is Scotland and single malts?
Well, yes, because I felt like Kentucky, like nobody was doing that within bourbon. All of the bourbon that you could buy was made on a column still. You know, you were lucky if it told you the distillery that made it. You know, it was a lot of kind of, we trade barrels behind the scenes, and there was just so much, so little information, so little transparency, and so little of interest in the process. Whereas I did feel that Scotch whiskey had preserved some of the best elements of through law, and pot still Irish whiskey, I would also say, have preserved through their sort of traditions, but ensconced in the technical files as they relate to Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey. And I felt like, for me as a hobbyist, the pot still was a real innovation. It was very clearly better than running my little still as a column still, and gave a whiskey with more character, more flavor, more texture. And I think that continues to be the case in Kings County's whiskeys. When you, particularly our high proof whiskeys, when you compare our barrel strength whiskeys to other American barrel strength whiskeys, I think the quality of the pot still and the quality of the distillate is very apparent at that high proof.
So, what are some of your favorite Irish and Scotch whiskeys?
Well, it can be difficult to comment because there's always asterisks when it comes to everything. But Bruichladdich is a company that I look to as being analogous in many ways to what we're doing. They're an old distillery, but they're a new distillery. They have been very creative with what they have been able to do, and are very much determined by their place in Islay, and so less about flavor profile there, but more about just the kind of approach to whiskey making being very expansive, unpretentious. Irish whiskey, I think, had become so monolithic with a handful of distilleries making everything, whereas now you do have a lot of new distillers that have opened up in the model of an American craft distillery, which is smaller but is more nimble and can really bring some variety back to Irish whiskey in ways that has probably been lost for an even longer time than American whiskey had been sort of lost to industrialization and modern and sort of, I don't want to say oversimplification, but really, the variety that comes with people experimenting and who aren't necessarily chemical engineers, and who are going by flavor as opposed to what they've been taught how to do things in the lab. Yields really interesting results, and it's been great for American whiskey. It will be great for Irish whiskey, and someday it'll be good for Scotch whiskey too. Even though, to some extent, Scotch has protected that more so than American or Irish tradition, I think.
So, when you started, cooking corn in the kitchen, and then moving into where you are today, how do you see the next 5 to 10 years of growing the distillery? Yeah. What's your vision for it?
Well, the hope is that people are still interested in whiskey. I mean, there's definitely been maybe if you're the kind of person who wants to get into whiskey, you've already gotten into whiskey, and the question is just what will the younger audience, will they discover it? Will they become interested in it? I think whiskey is still growing, and I think the kind of whiskey that we represent, which is small, idiosyncratic, very transparent with what we're doing and why we're doing it, will continue to be very interesting to people, and more so even now than in the last 10 years, where there was a lot of enthusiasm for American whiskey, but coming really to the sort of anybody who could put a brand out there, people would rush to it and just, kind of like pizza, like, oh, it's good, I like it. There wasn't a whole lot of
Good comparison.
good. Yeah, people were just sort of like, oh, I like whiskey. It kind of tastes like everything else I've ever had, but I'm gonna say that I like it. I mean, if there just wasn't that much variety, and therefore, if you put out, the industrial thing, but in a different bottle with a charismatic salesperson, it worked for a while. My hope is that as the public gets sort of tired or disinterested of those kind of things that really aren't that different, the story is sort of thin, that they will come around to some of the really interesting things that are happening within craft spirits, which are by definition somewhat limited and somewhat rare and somewhat hard to come by, as opposed to the things that are sort of artificially rarefied, like the Pappy Van Winkle coming from Buffalo Trace. I mean, Buffalo Trace could spend all day, every day making Pappy Van.
What does it take to grow into a sustainable distillery and a business? How do you grow it?
Yeah, I think it certainly is very challenging to do it the way that we have done it, which is to release only whiskeys that you make. And so it took us a year before we had 1-year-old bourbon, and maybe more like 5 years before we had a 4-year-old bourbon. And even now that we have a pretty regular 4-year bourbon, it's our most commonly sold whiskey. There's still some of the really rarefied things like the 7-year, and we just have a few barrels that have now crossed into 10 years. That there's no way to cheat time. There's no way to have anything other than patience when it comes to wanting to have those whiskeys. So, and it is extremely challenging to finance, especially in New York City, holding whiskeys for more than 10 years. So, I think for our history, we've, had very smart investors who have helped us, put together a good plan, but every plan is speculative and you don't know where the world of whiskey's going. So, my only hope is that we get to stick around and get to continue to be creative and continue to find maybe not a huge audience, but a meaningful audience amongst whiskey drinkers, and be thought of really as, a bottle that if you see it somewhere, you'll be interested to try it, because that if you've never had it before, it will be different than everything you've had. It'll be good. And if you've had it before, it'll be a return to something hopefully that was familiar and, that you liked a lot.
Enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I visited the distillery, I felt there's a very strong connection between the neighborhood and the distillery.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, and you were talking a little bit about when we're talking about Empire Rye and the connection to East Coast heritage. So, and community to, the way I experience whiskey is very important. So how do you connect all of these together? How do you view that?
Yes. Well, certainly being a distiller in New York City is a great opportunity, because New York is composed of so many cultures from around the world. And there is this diversity of cultural diversity that really, I think, enriches the project of making something. I mean, there's a reason that that Brooklyn is so almost parodied for its sort of craft food producers and craft beverage landscape. But really, that is an opportunity, and not just in terms of food, but just people from all over the world who have different preferences and interests, and so to be able to make a whiskey for every person in New York City is a is a broader thing than making a whiskey for every person in Kentucky, perhaps. And so that to me is very important to be part of that culture of New York City. Also, the restaurant culture of New York City, because of that, is also very broad, diverse, rich. You don't have the sort of chain restaurants that you have in other cities. And so you can be a part of that culture too through cocktails. And so that's very important. And then just the history, there's so much history of distilling specifically around us in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Al Capone was born across the street. You have moonshiners that were shot and died in the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of history, that they just don't really want to tell in schools, and because it's alcohol, but it's still a very fascinating history. And so to be able to, Kentucky has its history, Scotland has its history, New York City has a history, and it's ours to continue to promote, to rediscover. And so that piece of it is also very important to us. And the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a particular location where it's only manufacturing businesses that are in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So we are also surrounded by other entrepreneurial small businesses. And that's nice too. We're not in a neighborhood which has its own politics. We're really in part of this district, which is set aside by the city of New York. The city is our landlord, and it's set aside for manufacturing.
Yeah, and you're supporting each other. It's beautiful. So I'm going to go back to my first question where I asked, why are you doing this? To the question that bothers me personally.
Yeah.
How do you keep the passion going? And you're not like, oh, I can't, I just, after 2 years of tasting from the barrel every day, I just don't want to look at it anymore. How do you make sure that doesn't happen,
I don't think there's much danger of that, really. Because every year we have older and older whiskeys. Every year we have more and more to pick from to put in the bottle. It is really this situation where you keep setting the conditions, but every year the opportunities get bigger and richer, and there's just more fun with the older whiskeys. So I haven't gotten bored with it. I should also say that as I started out, I was doing the distilling and very quickly handed that off to others who I taught. And now the production side of the factory is managed by Brandon, and then the blending side of the business is managed by Ryan. So there are others who are more responsible for the flavor profile, or exclusively responsible for the flavor profile. And my role is really to make sure that things like pot distilling are continued, of continued importance, that the products that we put out are the right mix of experimental and traditional. My role is different than being the person who's like stirring the mash. But I do come to the business with an understanding of that. And I think that's really rare, that there is somebody who's at the sort of business side of a distillery who really has that experience of being a distiller. And, I think it's a competitive advantage because I care about whiskey. Whereas somebody who's working in an ad agency, who has a client who's Diageo, who's putting out Johnny Walker, it's just a different level of engagement. So,
yeah.
So because I love whiskey and have always loved whiskey, well, not always, but, since I was, let's say 25 or 30, have been very interested in whiskey. It hasn't bored me yet. So
what was the first one that you had that made you fall in love with it?
Well, that's a good question. It was maybe Elijah Craig, which was 20 years ago. It came in a box. It was like a bottle in a box. So that's what made it nice. It was not just, so that was, I remember the sort of fancy thing that people would buy.
Made an impression.
Yeah. But it was a very different landscape of whiskey. This is now 30 years ago, not 20 years ago. So, but also visiting distilleries, that's another thing that I've grown to appreciate as a distiller myself. I visited a distillery, even though I grew up in Kentucky. It was not until I was in college that I actually went to a distillery, and it was Woodford Reserve. And they had just rebuilt their distilleries right after they opened their distillery in the model of a Scotch whiskey distillery, not a Kentucky bourbon distillery. Possibly because that was my first introduction to what American whiskey could be, which was already filtered through this lens of an international company that wanted bourbon to have a Scotch
legacy.
Yeah. So that may have had an impact on what we've become, but I think so there has been a long continuous sort of shift in the way that whiskey's been marketed to be less about a sort of cocktail ingredient that's there to get you intoxicated towards something that can be convivial and experiential and part of
intellectual, social.
Yes, exactly.
Right, yes,
right.
Yeah, the
all sort of a little bit artificial, but nonetheless, an opportunity for connecting to people in an age when
very much so.
Increasingly people are becoming disconnected
very much so.
Yeah.
So that was great, really fascinating. And is there anything that I did not ask you and you wanted to share?
Not necessarily, other than I would just invite everybody to come to the distillery in New York City. We're open 7 days a week. Our tasting room is open 7 days a week. We have tours Thursday to Sunday. And it's really just a great thing if you're at all into whiskey. There are a few other distillers in New York City, but I think we are the one that is most committed to whiskey, and have our tours I think are consistently high rated, and so I would just come visit us and learn firsthand and taste firsthand what we're about, and hopefully bring that with you wherever you go.
Yeah, I can attest to the experience. I mean, the building is extremely impressive, and the stills are impressive, and the warehouse that hosts all of the barrels, it's a lot of fun, and the tasting is great. So 100%. So Thank you so much, Colin.
Great to hear. Thank you, Aline, for having me.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah.
I'm just going to digest that.